"Anything on our flank?" James asked, his vision tunneling through the scope of his rifle as he tried to concentrate on observing the target area. "You'd hear my screams of excitement if there was," Athena replied sarcastically, and although he could neither see nor hear her at the moment apart from the voice transmitted directly into his ear, he just knew she was doing some sort of bored fiddling with either one of her weapons or something in the environment. Any transmission of their voice to the outside of their masks had been cut off, leaving only direct comms as a way to talk, and obviously she knew better than to make any noise while guarding him here, so his confidence that he would have heard her if she had tried to leave had to suffice as evidence that she was actually still behind him. Not that he wouldn't have believed her managing to sneak off somehow, given all her complaining. "If you wanted the sniper role, you should have spoken out during any of the briefings," he informed her dryly, seeing that nothing was moving within his sights currently, "'cause whining to me about it now isn't going to change a damn thing." Athena's voice spluttered mockingly. "What's there to complain about?" she asked. "You got the scores in sniping, and I have mine in closer quarters. Our roles have been assigned accordingly." James sighed. Yeah, he mumbled, fully aware that their scores in said exercises barely differed enough to matter in the end. Sure, he was the better shot, but only by a few decimals. And she was a bit quicker at the draw, but not lethally so. They could have exchanged their roles in this mission without much issue. In fact, it would be a negative amount of issue, because it would have kept Athena from constantly bitching about having to guard him. However, James barely had time to think about it, because at that moment... "We've got movement," he informed his backup, causing the first non-voice noise that came out of her in a while, presumably when she turned towards him. "Well, what are you waiting for?" she asked with a disgruntled tone. "It's fire at will. As long as they don't happen to wear a UHSTF uniform, we have a confirmed number of 0 friendlies on site." Reason was very clear on that part. Under his mask, James started to chew his lip. Obviously he knew that. He had been there as well, after all. Fire at will? He just wasn't very willing. He hadn't exactly signed up to be an executioner. Then again, he technically hadn't signed up at all. Or, well, he had, but not willingly. There it was again. "Get ready to move," he grumbled in malcontent, while bringing his scope around to the unsuspecting man's head. He was a Caucasian, and the utter unpreparedness that both his clothing and demeanor showed for the jungle strongly hinted at him being a very recent addition to this environment. He showed too much skin. Sun and bugs were clearly eating him alive, but he also didn't know how to bundle up and stay cool at the same time. Someone who had been hastily forced to come to a place like this. For a second, his blue eyes even looked up in James's direction, though obviously it was by sheer accident. He couldn't have spotted anything from this distance with his eyes alone, even if James hadn't been camouflaged. Hard to believe that someone like that would be worth taking out on sight. But James also knew better, and the bullet was already out. It crossed multiple miles in a second and utterly eviscerated the man before he had any chance to know what happened to him. At its source, the loud explosion of the shot rang out instantaneously. But at its destination, the sound would need some time to catch up to the projectile, and would only be heard some 20 seconds later. Immediately, James was on his feet, rifle hanging from his chest. Athena had long crouched next to him, and was ready to move within fractions of a second. Together they tore off into the brush. Immediately repositioning after each shot fired was imperative for survival. And as they went, Athena called in the kill, and announced their repositioning. Poor bastards, James mused aloud, after the first long burst of movement was behind them, and they had gained a comparatively safe distance to their previous location. He could basically taste Athena roll her eyes, although he obviously couldn't see her face. "Not like they don't have it coming," she replied, ever the soldier at heart. They had been ordered to kill these people, so it was obviously the right thing to do for her. I wouldn't waste my energy on worrying about them. James made a scornful sound in return. "Would it kill you to have a little compassion?" he asked, echoing his earlier statement in a new context. "We have no idea why they're down there." Athena exhaled exasperatedly. "They are down there because they're nuts," she replied, sounding very sure of that fact. "Unless you want to believe they're actually evil. I'm going with crazy myself, but dangerously crazy. You've seen the reports. You're damn right I have." James cut her off, annoyed. "But I still wonder what leads someone to get this way. I mean, something along the way must have gone horribly wrong for them to end up in a place like this, don't you think? In the end, these people need help, not bullets." It wasn't like James couldn't sympathize at all. According to the intel Reason had provided them, most of these people were deserting military, mostly part of the defense fleet, which explained their lack in terrestrial expertise. All court-martialed in one way or another, they managed to evade their punishment with the help from some of their then not yet discharged buddies, who had obviously also been convicted since. Not like he had never thought about telling the military to suck it, but he wouldn't have ever let it get this far. Obviously, they originally were just supposed to be recaptured and retried, but it turned out they had other ideas, and not an insignificant number of people had gotten injured in the efforts of taking them in. First other soldiers, then the locals. And when the death toll started to rise, it was decided that they had made their choice to waive their right for a trial this time. Not helping their case was the strange readings that scanners and instruments had picked up from their base they had fortified in the middle of the jungle. Seemingly, they were experimenting with nasty stuff in there. Hyperspace generation. It seemed they were possibly trying to recreate relativity weaponry. Unsuccessfully so far, obviously. And it was unlikely that they ever would succeed. But the damage they could do while trying was enough to take them out quickly. Those same experiments were also the reason their base wasn't just glass from orbit. If they had the wrong generator running when it got exploded, it could have ended very badly, especially for large parts of the jungle. If that's what you think, then why are you taking the shot anyway? Athena asked, pulling him back into the here and now. She didn't exactly sound confrontational, more annoyedly curious. Not actually candid to his thoughts, but at least wanting to hear them, if only to mock them better. Because I have to, James replied through gritted teeth, the taste of blood filling his mouth from chewing on his lips so much. The images of the victims these people had claimed flashed through his mind. I'm not naive. At this point, even if they can still be held, they'll do way too much damage before that time comes. But that doesn't mean I have to be damn happy about it. And if you really can't even understand that, I suggest we focus on the mission and you let me brood in peace. Athena shook her head with an indignant exhale through her nose. She seemed to be getting ready for a retort, when suddenly a noise cut through the woodwork, making the both of them listen up in absolute silence. There was a whirring in the air. It would have been hardly audible had it not been for their masks amplifying sounds like these right into their ears. Something was cutting through the air. Fast. Sharp. And it was coming closer quickly. Larger people have a much harder time getting out of your way than you have getting out of theirs. Warrant Officer Rook Tuzma harshly admonished Sheeda, who stood in front of him in a stiff salute, very concentrated on neither moving her legs nor her tail as she listened to him. Though she couldn't quite keep her ears under control, and they twitched slightly at his words, especially whenever they heard something disagreeable. In fact, specifically you have a much easier time to get out of anybody's way than they have getting out of yours. From now on, you will make way for other crew members when your paths intercept, no matter the rank of your opposite. Are we clear? Sheeda swallowed heavily. I did get out of their way, sir. Sheeda tried to defend the earlier scene, during which her new superior had apparently observed her. She didn't get what the big deal was. It wasn't like she had run into anybody. And what had rank to do with it? She hadn't tried to pull rank in her memory. Rook Tuzma sighed, and made a wriggling motion with his long arms. A very strange gesture of displeasure, but one Sheeda would have to get used to. Slipping through someone's legs is not an appropriate way to make way for them, he said firmly, his narrow eyes narrowing even more as he stared at Sheeda, while his four ears twitched nervously. You will step aside and let them pass. It should be barely any effort for you, and is therefore the least you can do to accommodate your fellow crewmates. Sheeda had to suppress a disagreeing sound. Sure, she could easily get out of everyone's way, but that would also mean she'd have to stop in her tracks all the time. And she was moving faster than everyone else to begin with. Her way of just snaking and weaving through the forest of legs and limbs coming at her in the halls had worked so far, so why was it suddenly a problem? She did already make room whenever she could. She just also kept moving during it. But there was no arguing with your superior. Yes, sir, she confirmed, a bit half-heartedly. What was that? Warrant Officer Rook Tuzma asked with a tilt of his head, all four of his ears turning right at her, as if he was listening intently. Yes, sir, Sheeda repeated, putting her best acting into saying it clear and loud. Very well, Rook Tuzma then confirmed with a nod. The primate's posture and movement were stiff and slow, and didn't at all remind of the power behind Uton's gait, as he turned and waved for Sheeta to follow him. As she moved to come after him, he continued to monologue. Everyone knows of your inherent advantages on the corporeal side. You don't have to constantly prove it to anybody. In fact, you'd have a much easier time being part of this crew if you held back from time to time. While hoping that her supervisor wouldn't notice, Sheeta couldn't help but roll her eyes. She had already been part of the crew long before he had shown up here. Sure, she may not have been the most well-liked person on the ship, but everyone on board knew her. And everyone knew that they just had to let her do her thing and she wouldn't do anything to anybody. Also, what did he mean by constantly prove? Was her just moving around trying to prove a point all of a sudden? She was just moving from A to B, but somehow that was wrong now because she did it? But still, she couldn't argue. Or at least she shouldn't, not so shortly after meeting her new supervisor. Due to them still being docked at the station, the floors of the ship were still very empty for the most part, and the gravity was still very low. Sheeta felt like she was already holding back plenty, given that she wasn't jumping around all over the place. Unburdened by other crew or gravity, they traversed the ship for a while longer. Speaking of which, I've been meaning to ask you about your identifier. Ruktusma suddenly spoke up again, starting the sentence like there hadn't just been a long pause in their conversation as they neared the living area. Sheeta surprisingly tilted her head and lifted one ear. What about it, sir? She asked, her curiosity barely hiding the still disapproving tone hiding behind her voice. You have not been wearing it, Ruktusma stated simply. That is against protocol. Sheeta almost stopped in place in confusion. He couldn't possibly be serious. My uniform serves as my identifier, sir, she carefully informed him, wondering if there was any way that he did not know that, despite being tasked as her supervisor, that is not against protocol. The warrant officer stopped for a moment and looked back at her, his eyes scanning her up and down. That is another thing, he said, only barely acknowledging her input as something that happened. I don't see the need for protective clothing in your line of work. And while it is not directly harmful to your duties, the constant use of it does pose a certain waste of resources necessary for its upkeep. Therefore, you should leave your protective gear in your cabin for the time being, and suffice with your identifier, until the time comes when you actually need it. Sheeta now also stood, and this time she also stood her ground. While she wasn't exactly approved, there was no way she would be walking around naked all the time. My clothing is not protective gear, sir. It is a common everyday article for my people, she said, trying to stay as respectful as possible while fully denying anything he had just tried to order. And any Miat serving in the communal military, along with any other species that prefers to wear clothes on a regular basis, has full confirmation by communal doctrine that they may not be prohibited from doing so unless it causes a direct impediment to their work. Even though she had left Unima, she was still a Miat, and while that may have brought a lot of disadvantages with it, she still knew her rights. Supervisor or not, she wasn't going to budge on this point, and there was literally nothing he could do about it. Ruktusma looked at her in clear disapproval, and the gears of his mind seemed to be turning while he very clearly tried to figure out a way to discredit what she had just said. However, as it was basically chiseled into the very foundation of their contracts, there was very little he could do or say, no matter how much he disapproved. No need to be so defensive, I wasn't giving you an order, he finally said dismissively, which was somehow a blatant lie and the truth at the same time. And technically he hadn't formulated it as an order, but if you constantly wear your differentness on your literal body, it's not going to make anything easier for you. And as the person tasked with guiding you for your future career, I was giving you some well-intentioned advice. He lifted both of his arms in her direction, gesturing to what amounted to all of her, as he fully turned around to her and continued. Do you think people don't notice that you constantly try to set yourself apart from them? Do you think they don't see you always trying to be different? Do you think they don't mind the extra work it makes for them? Sheeta's jaw and lips quivered for a moment, but she stood firm. If she believed the look she got on a daily basis would disappear if she just dropped her clothes, she may have even considered it, but she knew they wouldn't. People would still stare at her eyes and claws, even if she got naked. They would still be warned about her when they entered the crew, not matter if she wore uniform or identifier. She wasn't trying to be difficult, she was different, and no amount of trying to hide it would change that fact. So if everyone else wasn't going to be comfortable with her anyways, she may as well be comfortable herself. I will continue to wear my uniform, sir, she simply stated, in a slightly meeker voice than she had expected to come out of herself. she didn't feel like elaborating. She didn't feel like he would listen. Rook Tuusma grunted, displeased. But again, there was nothing he could do about it. The letter had contained orders. Not just any orders. Orders coming directly from a councilman. Councilman Ujujio of the Zanhathai. Someone from the very leadership of the galaxy. Admittedly, Raprik hadn't been entirely sure if a councilman could give any official orders to military personnel without an intermediary in between. But how could he refuse the call from someone who held the highest of the high authorities in this world? The orders had been pretty simple. He just had to follow someone, remain undetected, and compile a report about what he had observed. One of the Sipper's Lane's easiest exercises. Not being spotted was what they were bred for. Although, admittedly, the specific target made it slightly trickier than usual. Atol Nastrocyte. The largest sapient predators of the galaxy weren't only known for their size and battle hunger. No, they were also famous for their acute awareness of their surroundings at almost all times, their four eyes constantly moving to take in the room around them. Not being seen by one proved to be a challenge, but not an insurmountable one. They had fields of vision and lines of sight like anybody else. It just took some more finesse to find the gaps within them. Luckily, the great community station bore no shortage of hiding spots, be it decoration, utilities, or other passers-by. And so Raprik could easily weave around while remaining out of sight and keeping watch of the enormous, bladed titan of a carnivore. Although admittedly, he didn't exactly know what exactly the significance of anything he was seeing was. To him it seemed that the giant lizard just went about his day. Sure, he did some things that were odd to Raprik, mostly predator things, but that was hardly a surprise. He walked around, talked to some people, although he ignored most. Went to eat something around noon, where he also met a parasling, who Raprik understood to be a neighbouring species of the Tomastrocytes in the Orion Arm. The two large carnivores greeted each other with a brief yet intense tussle that scared a good number of the people around them, and from which the lizard ultimately emerged victorious by pushing the Zorbsider to the ground and holding them down with one of his large maulers for a time. Certainly unusual for most, but not for Tonastrocytes. They were known to stir up fights wherever they went, and this scuffle was pretty tame in comparison to things you usually saw, most likely because the two were already acquainted and didn't need to actually test their strength. After their fight, the two predators went into a carnivore restaurant, and admittedly, Raprik looked away for a while as they devoured a frankly sickening amount of dead flesh. Raprik suspected that his entire self would have had room on those plates without satisfying their hunger, should he have been served for dinner. After food, the two went to an establishment specializing in UV technology, where the two reptiloid descendants basked in artificial starlight for over an hour, seemingly falling asleep under the lights while digesting the mountains of flesh in their stomachs. After a very long time of nothing happening, they then finally seemed to move to their ultimate destination. On a large plaza, in the inner courtyard of the old community palace, they approached a lone figure who was sitting on some of the architecture, looking like a mere pebble next to the towers of white that formed the old, venerable building. The bipedal figure was masked, and the body was covered in black fabric all over, but what he could see of it was mostly hairless, making Raprik think that it was a Miat at the first glance. However, he quickly noticed that would have to be a rather strange Miat, one without ears, or a tail, or stripes. This had to be some species he didn't recognize. Or did he? Something in the back of his mind rang a bell again, similar to the situation with Hyphaty. They had been on the news a while ago, hadn't they? Right? A new species that had joined. What were they called again? He couldn't remember, but they seemed strange to him. At the very least, they showed absolutely no fear when approached by the two massive carnivores, beelining it towards them. Instead, they greeted the giants with eagerly waving arms. It was likely they were acquainted. Once they had seemingly gotten done with pleasantries, the strange, small being jumped off the foot of the pillar they had been sitting on, and obviously began to urge their new company in the direction of the entrance of the palace, gesturing intently to get their large companions to move faster, along with them, as they easily outpaced the giants. Not knowing what to make of this all, Raprik followed them. Though it was rather eventless, they simply strolled through the enormous halls of the palace. Every now and then, they stopped to marvel at the sights or take pictures. Sometimes they read one of the informational plaques and signs that were offered all over the place. The small masked creature seemed to be quite excited about everything, while the Tenastrosite looked like he had seen it all before. Reprigue wondered what the mask was for. Was it important that that person remained anonymous for some reason? Ultimately, he didn't see much more, just more of the same, until finally the group moved to leave the palace again. Reprigue was about to follow them out when he was suddenly stopped by a thin appendage wrapping itself along his shoulders that pulled him back with gentle force. In surprised shock, he turned in the direction of the appendage's owner, and this time recognition came to him a lot quicker when he looked into HFY's marvel face. "Nice work," she immediately praised him, before he had any time to process or ask what was happening to him. "That'll be enough for now. Take the rest of the day to write up your report." It took Reprigue a moment to shake off his surprise at the warrant officer, once again suddenly appearing in his proximity without any indication of how she'd done it. Briefly he glanced after his target, that had by now gained considerable distance from them, being constantly hurried along by their much smaller companion. "All right then," was all he could get out for the moment, slightly lost in thought about what he had witnessed today. And, thinking about how long he had been walking around already, his stomach suddenly began to growl. Despite long pauses his target had taken during his observation, he had never dared to leave them to go eat something, in fear of not finding them again after. HFY's laugh erupted in an orchestra of plucked strings. "Oh my," she said, a single arm coyly twisting out to press against the plate covering her face. "Or maybe you would like to get something to eat first. I'd love to accompany you, if you would have me. I'm sure you have some thoughts you'd like to share." And surely, Reprigue nodded. "Those I have," he admitted, before pensively putting a hand onto his growling stomach. He now felt the hunger that had been building up over the day. However, he didn't really have any appetite. The picture of the feasting carnivores was still fresh in his mind. So much flesh. But I don't think I can eat anything right now. HFY scoffed brightly. "Oh my," she repeated, and one of her arms quickly reached down to stroke across the fur on his back. "Don't tell me we have found a Deathworlder with a weak stomach." Reprigue perked up, ready to reprimand her. However, he stopped short. Usually he would have taken exception to that designation and admonished her for applying it to him. However, the way she said it was different. She simply used the word with so much enthusiasm in her voice that it just didn't seem like she had any second thoughts behind it. For the first time, it really seemed like it was just a designation when somebody used it, and so he let it go. "I'm sure once you have some food in front of you, your mood will shift dramatically," she assured him, talking as if she spoke from experience, and began to gently lead him out of the door of the palace. The whirring sound came by again, becoming constantly louder as it filled the air, until it finally reached a zenith, and subsequently got quieter again. The shadow of the drone danced across the leaves of the bushes around them, as it briefly blocked out the sun, while it steadily hovered along above them, carried by 4 quiet rotors. James and Athena pressed themselves into the mud as it flew by, covered by the long, entwined roots of a large, gnarly tree. Their limbs were contorted in uncomfortable angles to fit in between the wood, and the small room in their hiding spot made it necessary for the much slimmer Athena to climb deeply into the crevices hidden in the jumble of roots that James couldn't reach with his wider frame, while he took up the remaining wider room that was further out. This, however, also forced him to basically have his head in between her knees, because there was barely enough room for the both of them to fit, forcing them to use every bit of room they could make for themselves. And in that both awkward and uncomfortable position, they had waited and endured for at least the past hour now, only able to watch as the drones regularly passed by their position. They had counted at least 4 so far, at least 4 they could distinguish from one another, and the autonomous machines kept a tight lockdown of the area with an effective routine of patrols that left them no time to reposition in between the passing automatons. Communications had been cut off somehow. They were on their own, and for the moment they were nailed down. "How by Mamon's greed did they get a psychopomp?" Athena asked agitatedly, her voice only audible to James, as she looked after the flying machine slowly gaining in distance. James could only mildly shake his head, which he surely felt as it bumped against her legs. "No idea," he replied earnestly. "That was some advanced tech. Certainly nothing people who were seemingly completely cut off should have access to." Athena growled. "Reason better prepared to meet their maker once I get my hands on them," she said darkly, and shifted slightly, likely to at least get somewhat comfortable, or at least prevent sores from forming from the constant pressure on her. James contemplatively clacked his tongue. "Probably not their fault," he mumbled, to which Athena immediately snapped. "How is it not their fault?" James really didn't feel like arguing here, but ignoring Athena was probably not going to help her stay calm and focused here, and neither were telling her to calm down. "I don't know," he replied subduedly, doing his best to keep the position he was currently in because it was at least bearable compared to the previous one. Must be hard as hell to get any intel on a situation like this. How are they supposed to know what's in every garage or every bunker unless it gets rolled out at some point? They probably did their best with the information they had. Athena huffed almost wrathfully. "It's their fucking job to get us information like this, Buzz," she hissed, and imbued the use of his unwanted nickname with some extra venom. "And it's their fucking job so situations exactly like this one don't happen. We could have been dead if we were any more out in the open. Do you get that?" James couldn't help but get defensive, which he knew was about the worst thing he could do right now. "Obviously," he hissed right back at her, "but they aren't psychics. We're all just human, and I want to hear them bitch about a missed shot just as little as I want to hear about any of us bitch about a missing detail." Athena disdainfully laughed at that. "Oh, right, as long as they let you fuck up, you're willing to let them fuck up?" she mocked him viciously. This really wasn't the time for any of this, and James was sure she knew that just as much as he did. But, just like he, she likely couldn't really fight it. Being pinned down like this didn't exactly help their animosity towards each other. And being unable to do anything but think made it hard to control all emotions. "That's how it works when you're working together," he says grimly, trying and failing to hold back the annoyance in his voice. "It's not the point to be at each other's throats all the time." James didn't actually feel like defending Reason all that much here. After all, his life was also in danger because of their blunder. But this was about more than that at this point. Athena scoffed. "If people die when you mess up, then you can't mess up," Athena said harshly. "As simple as that." "I know that," James countered immediately. "But it still happens, and there's fuck all you can do about it. And believe it or not, making everyone feel even worse about it won't help that either." He could hear Athena open her mouth through the comm line, but a renewed oncoming of the whirring noise interrupted them, causing them to hunker down more tightly once more, which also gave them both a second to cool down. "And just why do you care?" Athena asked after a moment, her masked face still pressed into the mud as the drone flew by overhead. "None of this is important to you. You're just doing your time here anyway, aren't you? Just a roadblock for a while and then you're gone. So why don't you pretend like you're so damn invested in how I behave, huh?" James exhaled slowly. "Because whether I like it or not, I've still got more than a year of this ahead of me," he explained, also keeping his body down below the wood, while the shadow slowly creeped over the leaves. "And that's more than a year during which, whether I like it or not, I have to trust you with my life. And I would be much happier if I could be glad to do so for once." The drone flew away again, allowing them to pull their faces out of the mud safely. "And I'm supposed to trust someone with my life who thinks mess-ups are just hunky-dory?" Athena asked him, and turned her head in his direction as much as she could. Her tone had calmed somewhat. It was still accusing, but nowhere near as wrathful anymore. James exhaled slowly through his nose. "Of course not," he replied. "But if one of my mess-ups would endanger you, don't you think I'd be beating myself up over that way more than you ever could?" Athena chuckled, her mud-covered hair slightly swaying from the movement. "Why?" she asked. "You don't like me, never have." "Doesn't mean I want you dead," James replied earnestly. "And besides, I've been trying to be at least accommodating after our rocky start." "How was I supposed to know your mother was such a sore topic?" she said, sounding at first like she just wanted to dismiss him. "Everyone I'd ever met had nothing but adoration and reverence for Vice Admiral Krieger." Everyone, Athena included. She had never made a big secret about who her idol in the military was, even if James's mother did serve in a different branch from the two of them. The topic didn't exactly help with his mood, especially with the tone Athena was taking. However, her voice then suddenly mellowed out as she added, "But don't think I don't appreciate it. I've never felt the need to bring it up, but I did notice you driving off Asmodeus around me. Believe it or not, I've gotten pretty in tune about stuff like that over the years, and you'll be surprised how few people actually manage to look away for good. So I guess I can respect at least that much." Unseen underneath his mask, James lifted an eyebrow. Honestly, he never expected that something as simple as not gawking would have been worth noticing to anyone. In his mind, that had always been the default, and people gawking was the noticeable circumstance. Always the problems you don't have, I guess, he thought to himself. And I guess you should know that I don't actually hold the thing with my mother against you, he gave back, considering they were opening up already. The thing between me and her, it's personal. And I know other people don't have that problem. I'm not exactly running around being mad at everyone for not hating her on my behalf, but I know it can seem that way when I get grumpy whenever she comes up. Athena hummed in agreement. I guess it's not that I can't understand at all, she confessed after a bit of thought. But I've worked very hard to get where I am. So having somebody get honestly mad about having it just handed to him, I guess it caught me on my bad side. James growled silently. Makes sense, I guess, he said. But I'm trying to work hard towards getting where I want to be. And all of this really isn't part of that. Honestly, I still don't know why I agreed to any of it, so I guess I'm just as mad at myself, ultimately. Athena shifted slightly again, her legs chafing alongside the shoulders of his jacket as she apparently tried to keep them from stiffening up in this stagnant position. Makes sense, she mumbled. Apparently, being trapped like this with nothing to do but talk had a very strange silver lining indeed. Another drone passed by overhead, their visits just as frequent as they had been the whole time they were pinned down here. Communications remained dead, and the day soon turned to night, without them being able to move from their position. By now, any anxiousness or excitement at the constant danger they were still technically in had died down. At first it had been replaced by worry. Was everyone else alright? But they couldn't worry forever, so that soon turned into boredom and pain, as their stationary took more and more of a toll on their body. The fact that they were laying in thick mud that not only crusted them in dirt, but also made any adjustments to their positions a lot harder to pull off, didn't exactly help. At least coming up with a system for the watch overnight was easy enough. Try to sleep a bit, James said, after coming to his senses when Athena gently kicked him awake with her heel against his chest, after a few hours of dozing off. She obliged without many more words, while James was left to stare up at the bits and pieces of the starry sky he could see through the canopy up above. Every now and then, it was broken up by a circling drone. They still weren't giving up. At this rate, it would be a long day ahead of them. He hoped Athena would find some rest.